Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Film Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Show me your world, Chris.
Well, I thought we'd start with Crouch Tram Museum.
Great.
Dear Mum, Yorkshire is lovely, not like you said at all. They can smile, and they do sell my pasta sauce. The caravan bed is quite short, but Chris is a sensitive lover. Hope you can be happy for me. Love, Tina.
Yeah, good girl.
You are going to pick that up.
I didn't do that.
If you don't pick up this excrement immediately, then I'm going to have to inform the National Trust.
Report that to the National Trust, mate.
And that is a clip from 2012 Sightseers, directed by Ben Wheatley, written by Alice Lowe and Steve Oram, who also take the two lead roles in the film. And God, this is a film. If you've not seen this one, what a treat. Alice Lowe and Steve Oram, let's start there. They were the originators of what became this film. And they met in the early 2000s at a regular comedy night that was taking place in Ealing in London. Now, they got chatting about their respective Midlands backgrounds. I am from the West Midlands. I'm very proud of my background. They talked too about family holidays. As Alice Lowe would remember to The Guardian, she would talk about how her dad would drive them around Europe. They couldn't afford to fly, so they'd go in a car, and she just said we'd have these weird experiences. We'd be camping in someone's orchard with some creepy farmer coming on to my mum. She talked about how she remembered this Dutch family, all blonde and beautiful on their bicycles, the dad barbecuing in the rain in a really capable, athletic way, and how her dad was just scowling at him. And she just reasoned, there's something just really hilarious about all the little prejudices and jealousies. And this was starting to inform two characters that Alice Lowe and Steve Oram came up with. They would be Chris and his girlfriend Tina, Chris being an aspiring writer, Tina, who is basically trying to a degree impress her mum, played in the film by the wonderful Eileen Davis. And they workshopped this. They came up with a kind of a stage sketch show, which is where they first debuted these characters at the Ealing event that they met up with. And as they told IndieWire, they just said, we just found it funny, them talking about mundane things and then disposing of body parts in the same breath. And as Steve Oram would say, the idea to have them going on holiday and knocking people off whilst visiting tram museums was something that made us laugh. And they both realised there might be something in this. Now, their careers were slowly developing. I mean, just look at Alice Lowe's. Her career took a jump forward when she was cast in the stage version of Garth Marenghi's Dark Place. She found her way onto television, and she and Steve Oram were developing what would become Sightseers, and they turned it into a TV pitch, which they filmed. Now, Sightseers, if you've not had the pleasure, is a very dark comedy. There is brutal murder set alongside a lot of laughs. But it was the darkness of the story they wanted to tell that was resulting in them, when they sent their pitch out to TV companies, being shown the door a lot. And as Lowe said, everybody was coming back to us and going, it's really funny, but we can't possibly commission it. And she argued they'd worked on these characters, they'd pushed it, and she said it felt at certain points there were pressures from people asking if they had to be set in Birmingham, if they had to be Brummies, could we not film it just outside London? And they were sticking to their guns. Me and Steve were like, no, it has to be people who their hopes and dreams are based around the fact that they didn't have the opportunities that they could have had. That Lowe's talked quite a lot about growing up in the Midlands and how that's very different from the people who grew up in London. As someone who grew up in the Midlands, sometimes there was just not a lot to do. There wasn't exciting things going on the doorstep. You couldn't take a tube 20 minutes and be into the heart of things. If you were stuck in the outskirts of the Midlands, a lot of the time you were stuck in the outskirts of the Midlands. Now, that pitch that they did was directed by Paul King. Now, Paul King, who was doing The Mighty Boosh around this time, has gone on to do the Paddington films, of course. Just at the point this is recording, we're a couple of months away from his Willy Wonka film, Wonka. But that pitch wasn't going really very far, and they were getting the rejection. So they stuck it on the internet. And that's when Lowe also sent it to Edgar Wright. And now Edgar Wright saw it and loved it. This was post Hot Fuzz, and he forwarded it to the production company Big Talk, and Wright would join as executive producer as well. And I should also point out that the other production company that would ultimately come aboard the film was Rook Films, which is Ben Wheatley, Claire Jones and Andy Stark. And so as Ben Wheatley, who would come aboard as director, he saw this, he got sent this by Big Talk, and he just said, oh, this could make a movie. Now, at the point he saw it for the first time, his own career was only just building up, really. But after the acclaimed release of his own directorial debut, Down Terrace, which is a terrific film if you've ever had the pleasure, Big Talk got the script to him. So Down Terrace came out in 2019, and then Wheatley was moving on to the film Kill List, which I should come to in a future podcast as well at some point. But he also, those two films he'd authored with his co-writer and partner Amy Jump. This was now going to be the first time he'd taken on someone else's script. And so Wheatley described that he'd had a meeting with Big Talk, and they said they had this script, and the script was Sightseers. And he said, I knew it had come from Alice and Steve, and I pretty much agreed to do it without reading it because I knew them and wanted to work with them. Now, he'd worked with them already on a pilot for a TV show called Wrong Door that never ultimately got made. He also knew them from the comedy scene, and he said, I knew they'd come from an improv background, and I really fancied doing something that was quite free and easy. He said, you can bend their work out of shape because they always know the backgrounds of the characters. And Wheatley also said Amy Jump, who is my writing partner and co-editor, gets an additional material credit as she wrote additional scenes and characters, helped with the orders of events. But also Film 4 was getting involved and put a bit of development money in. Now, this paid for research trips, and in particular the Lowe and Oram went on 2 research trips around the UK in character, followed by a camera that was shooting the whole thing. And on one of those trips, Steve Oram and Alice Lowe shared a caravan for the whole trip. When she said, this really cemented our interaction as a fictional couple, as I now know exactly how annoying he could be. Beautifully, the trip that they went on, at least one of the trips, was planned by Steve Oram's dad as well, and they went round an assortment of fairly low-key tourist attractions. And it was off the back of all of this work that over the course of 3 years, 3 drafts were put together. And Lowe would just reflect that a lot of the dynamic is based on observing your parents over a long period, seeing what people will put up with and what compromises people make to be together. She said that was what we wanted people to get from the film. Why do people stay together? The research was quite intense as well. Lowe dug into the work of Robert Hare, a criminal psychologist researcher. She also looked at the cliche of female characters in cinema, deliberately went against that. Oram and Lowe also lent as an influence on Withnail and I, a film they're both very, very fond of. There was, as shooting approached in the autumn of 2011, just a slight fear that because the film takes them around British tourist attractions that don't necessarily tend to make the top of the TripAdvisor list, that some of them wouldn't necessarily be on the cooperative side. And I put this to Ben Wheatley, who now was he'd come off the back of Kill List, this was going to be his next film, and he just said none of them turned us down, and they were all super helpful. But he did reconcile, it's a tricky one, isn't it? He said, I think we were pretty open with them about what we were going to do and what the film was about, but you can't really put across tone in those conversations. And he said, I don't think anyone knew what the film was going to be like until it was done, because you just don't. He said, you might know what you're going for, but you might not get that, or you might get something else. That notwithstanding, they had enough here to get going. It was going to be a small cast fleshed out with the wonderful Monica Dolan, Jonathan Harris came in, Richard Lumsden, Richard Glover, and it was going to be 4 or 5 week shoot. The start of production was announced for the beginning of October 2011, and this was going to be location driven. They would go on their travels across Derbyshire, Yorkshire, the Lake District, all around England, visiting genuine museums that you see in the film. Now, just ahead of the start of filming, they did do some rehearsal work. Wheatley talked about these characters needing to work as film characters, that they'd worked on stage, they'd worked in TV, but they had to feel very, very real. They had to feel like the kind of people you could spend 90 minutes in. And he talked about the rehearsal process being mainly to take those characters and put them to bed, really. There was space for a lot of improvisation and interviews during that rehearsal period. There was improvisation while they were filming it as well. Wheatley also put in his homework and preparation to make sure that as the cameras roll, they wouldn't shy away from the violence. That the violence in the film is very, very intense. It's deliberately baiting the Daily Mail tabloid, which it did, as it turned out. And it comes in these short bursts. But the thinking was, if you're going to have real people and real characters and they commit real crimes, you can't make the violence cartoony. And he did concede, I really fought to get the gore in. Because he says, you start to think about what you're laughing at. He says, you sit through Fast and Furious and 1,000 people get shot in that. And it's as violent as a Bourne film, and it's a 12. In the case of Sightseers, this was clearly not going to be a 12, and because of the relatively modest budget of the film, it was never declared, but you couldn't imagine it was more than a couple of million. He had the control to be able to put his stamp on the violent nature of the film. Now, that doesn't mean it's wall-to-wall violence. It's just very, very, very carefully chosen. The film went into post-production and a release date was being put together for the end of 2012, but with Studio Canal picking up distribution rights in the UK, the plan was to debut the movie at the Cannes Film Festival in May of 2012. Now, that's okay. It didn't take an awful long time to edit the movie, and Wheatley would say that his television work was really a help here. That I asked him about the edit, and also I asked him about wrestling comedy on film. That comedy was something he'd had in his films, but he never lent into it as much. And the whole idea that it could just be like just a couple of frames could make the difference. And he said, no, it's not a couple of frames, it is a frame. And he said, I learned that from working with Henry Normal, a British television comedy legend. He said, the first thing I did with him was the TV show Ideal. He said he'd come into the edit suite, and what we do in Ideal is edit for a week, and then Henry comes in on the last day, looks at everything and goes through it all, and he'd be saying, cut that frame out, add a frame on that, and we'd be looking at each other going, some variant of Clucking Hell, I think that says, what's all this? And we watch it and it'd be better. And he says it hinges on it. The timings are absolutely crucial. It also helped too that Wheatley just says that he never really gets a full feel anyway of what a film is until it's done. And he says, you have this script, you know where you're going, but films are about performance and lucky accidents. And in the edit, you find other text and subtext when you're putting it together. He says it's disingenuous to say you don't know at all, but a script is not a blueprint that you can absolutely predict what will come out of it. And that was the case too with Sightseers as well, that as much as these characters had been in existence since the early to mid 2000s, and as much as Alice Lowe and Steve Oram knew them a lot by the time the cameras were pointed at them, you still didn't quite know where it was going to end up. Off then, with the film completed, the film went to the Cannes Film Festival, and I think it's one of those cases where you just genuinely don't know what the response was going to be, that the tonal shifts of the film are quite dramatic, and it's not a compromised film. This is obviously a very good thing, but it can make the critical response a little bit difficult. But on the whole, the response to Sightseers was really pretty good. Now, a couple of the UK's more prominent critics didn't really go for it as much, but there was enough of a critical thrust in its favour that there was confidence in the release of the film, that they felt that this could cut through. Some people just didn't find it funny. If you don't get the humour, you're in trouble. And in fact, when the film came to its wide release in the UK towards the end of 2012, infamously the Daily Mail critic gave it 1 star, and Ben Wheatley promptly went onto Twitter, back when Twitter worked and was nice, and just almost declared it a badge of honour. 1 star from the Daily Mail. He'd be disappointed not to get that. There is a line in the film that absolutely trolls the Daily Mail as well, so they knew what they were doing. But there was a kind of feeling, it's like, this is offending the right people. If you're going to get upset by it, these are the people who are going to get upset. And there you go. It's the establishment-y newspapers, the holier than thou, who are really finding this gets under their skin. A couple of credits I should note. Neera Park, a legendary producer in the UK, was one of the producers on it. And also a shout out to Laurie Rose, the wonderful cinematographer who shot the movie. But would it do much business at the box office? Well, it went into UK cinemas on the 30th of November 2012, and by the time it had got away from its Cannes Film Festival response and was a bit more on its it was a bit more focused towards the more general criticism, well, the response was slightly more upbeat, with the exception of that aforementioned newspaper. That said, there are easier times to launch a film than the end of November. If you just look at the films it was up against, you can see how intense the competition was. That the James Bond film Skyfall was on its 6th week of release and would gross nearly £100 million. Not even dollars, pounds in the UK by this point. It would cross that level in due course. The second Twilight film was going nuts. That was 3 weeks on release. There were other openers that weekend. DreamWorks' Rise of the Guardians, you would not say is a direct competition to Sightseers, but it was taking up screen space. Great Expectations was out. There was Talash was also playing. Alex Cross opened, and there'd been reasonable hopes for that as well. And then from the UK, Nativity 2, Danger in the Manger, I feel my best not comment on, I paid to see that, was also sat in the top 5. Silver Lining Playbook was around as well. And if you even look at the films, the rest of the top 10, Argo, End of Watch, I mean, this was competition and a half, and Sightseers ended up in the end in 12th place, taking £213,000 on its opening weekend. Now that's not particularly shabby really, and over time the film would make its money back on DVD of its Channel 4 screenings as well. I mean, it would do pretty well there. The second week on release for the movie, it was down, it lost half its business, £100,000, down to 13th place, as out came Seven Psychopaths as the big opener that week. But again, Skyfall was still going absolutely nuts. By its third week of release in the UK, which was the 14th to the 16th of December, well, Sightseers was dropping. It was down to 15th. It had lost the vast bulk of its business, £27,000 on its third week, as the first of the Hobbit films came along, as a Tinkerbell 3D movie came along as well. But still, by the end of its run, I mean, it was over £500,000. It hadn't done great guns, but it had certainly gained attention, and it had done a decent, I'd imagine it had done pretty much aligned with expectations for its cinema release. What's nice though about Sightseers is it continues to be talked about and it continues to be seen. I mean, the fact we're here talking about it over a decade after it first came out, and as a calling card for the people concerned, I mean, again, I mean, there's lots to praise there, that Steve Oram will go off and direct his own film. Alice Lowe's gone off and she's in post-production now on her second movie as well. And then of course there's Ben Wheatley, who at the point this is recorded, I mean, just a couple of months ago, was behind the camera for Meg 2: The Trench, and he's built a significant body of directorial work. Sightseers, though, might just be my favourite Ben Wheatley film, and I love a lot of Ben Wheatley films. I think what Alice Lowe and Steve Oram put on screen together is quite something. And I've paired it with Inception for a reason, because I think the way these podcasts work sometimes is people are drawn in by the more prominent film and occasionally want to discover something of a gem as they go. That may be the case, that may be not. I may be completely misreading it. But if you are on the lookout for something special that you might not have seen, and you've got a bit of a stomach for it, I can't recommend Sightseers enough. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you always for listening. As always, for listening. Thank you so much for your time. If I've not bored you completely, I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. The entire Film Stories project is on Twitter at Film Stories. I think it's on Blue Sky as well. We need to do something with it there. Facebook.com/Film Stories Online is where you'll find us there. YouTube.com/Film Stories. That YouTube channel is lumbering into life. We're doing quite a lot with that at the moment. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you'll find find our magazines for sale. We've also now put up for order our latest Blu-ray releases, for which we've put special extras on as well. We are doing the UK Blu-ray debut of a pair of Kevin Costner films, the Bull Durham and No Way Out. Neither has been issued on Blu-ray in the UK. As of 23rd of October 2023, you're able to get them both. You can find them at store.filmstories.co.uk, as well as all of our magazines as well. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, our website is full of movie mayhem, news, reviews, features. We update that a lot. We're putting a lot of work into that as well. But I've bored you enough, haven't I? Thank you so much for tolerating me this far. I'm now off to watch another bunch of films. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your support. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you all look after yourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.